The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Thank you for joining us here in FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. As we move closer to the November 5th state election, we're trying to do as best we can to try to speak to the candidates and those in favor and opposed to the 5 ballot questions on this year's state election to give you some insight onto why you should vote a certain way. Today, we're going to focus on one of the 5 ballot questions. We're actually going to focus on ballot question number 5, which is the minimum wage for tipped workers. If passed, this would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tipped worker over the course of 5 years. This would take effect to meet the current minimum wage as of January 1st of 2029. It would also propose and require employers to continue to pay tip workers the difference between the sub-minimum wage, which is currently $6.15 an hour, to meet the minimum wage. That will be through the end of 2028. It would also allow employers to sort of create a tip pool, which would combine all tips for those tip workers that could be shared among all workers, including non-tipped workers. Today, we're going to focus on the organization that is looking to ask voters to vote no on question 5. I'm pleased to be joined by Chris Keohan. He represents the Committee to Protect Tips, who are asking voters to vote no on question 5. Chris, thank you for joining me. How are you?
Thanks for having me today.
All right, let me just ask you right off the bat, why should voters vote no on question 5?
I think it's simple. Ask your server, ask your bartender the next time you go out. 91% of servers and bartenders in a recently completed poll oppose question 5. They think things work well for them. They didn't ask for this ballot question. They're not participating. A vast majority of them are not participating on the S side, and they don't want it. This would be bad for restaurants. It would be bad for the workers in the restaurants, and it would be bad for consumers.
You know, one of the Massachusetts wouldn't be unique if this were to pass. There are a number of states that have this in play. What do you see in those states that will help bolster your argument in terms of having people vote no?
Well, I'd say there are 7 states that currently don't have a tip credit. They never had a tip credit, so it's not necessarily comparing apples to oranges, apples to apples. Sorry. There are a couple of communities that you can look at that have implemented this. Portland, Maine implemented this several years ago. It was such a disaster that bartenders and servers marched to City Hall and had it overturned. Last year, it was implemented in Washington, D.C. In the first year, 10% of workers have left the industry, either to move to a different state to work because it's so close to Southern Maryland and Northern Virginia, or they've been laid off. That number is just now over 10%. Most recent reports coming out of DC are showing 4,000 out of 30,000 tipped employee jobs gone. So again, you look at this, and the very people that are supposed to be helped are the ones that are saying, I don't want this. What is happening? This is an out-of-state activist group that is pushing this. They tried to push it for 10 years in the legislature, and the legislature has rebuffed them every time because it's a bad idea. Every time they push this, they have to fly in from California and talk about what the issue is. They have to explain it to people, and the explanations they're giving are from other states. They can't even point to issues here in Massachusetts. And if you were an activist group that after 10 years had been trying to organize and still needed to pay nearly $1 million for the signatures to get this on the ballot, what does that tell you about the quality of the activist group? They're under investigation in multiple states. They're under investigation here in Massachusetts for announcing that they had a $2 million anonymous donor. They've been under investigation by the United States Congress for misuse, a potential misuse of their 501c3 status. And another state that they tried to get on the ballot this past year and failed, the Secretary of State there described them as a deceitful, duplicitous goat rodeo of a campaign. I don't think you can hear many politicians ever use language like that. But this is what we're dealing with. They say they represent servers and bartenders, and they don't have a single server or bartender that has donated to their campaign until recently. And that server, that bartender that donated, isn't even from this state, is from New York.
Yeah. Do you have any evidence in terms of, you mentioned that a lot of waiters and waitresses are opposed to this. We know that currently in Massachusetts, the current minimum tip wage is $6.15 an hour. What do waiters and waitresses typically make in terms with that $6.15 per hour wage?
So it's actually $6.75 right now.
Oh, I apologize.
And I know you had mentioned, oh, no, of course. I know you had mentioned earlier, it's worth reiterating because this is one of the biggest pieces of confusion. You are guaranteed as a server or bartender $15 an hour. If your tips and the $6.75 combined don't equal that $15 an hour, the owner must make up the difference. You are guaranteed $15 an hour. But when you talk to servers and bartenders, they say they don't want to be considered minimum wage workers because they make significantly more than that in many restaurants across the state. We did an interview a few weeks ago with Gretchen. She is she's a bartender down in the Plymouth area. She's 52 years old. She makes 3 times the minimum wage. She's a single mom who is able to pay her mortgage on what she's making at the bar. This is the type of life you can make as a tipped worker here in Massachusetts, and they're not asking for this change. They know full well that if this were to pass, and people saw that they were quote unquote making the full minimum wage, that their tips would go down. How do they know that? Because in the 7 states that don't have the tip credit, they consistently rank as the worst tipping states in the country. California, Toast, which is the CRM that processes most of payments across the country at this point, California ranks as the worst, and it's the example they provide the most. So if tipping goes down, if people can't afford to go out to restaurants because of the excessive price increases they're going to happen to meet this would cost the average restaurant $18,500 per employee. That's nearly $250,000, $300,000 per restaurant. Restaurants will close, automation will increase, prices will increase. If you look at Washington, D.C., there are service fees in virtually every restaurant at this point. You're going to hit a breaking point, and the breaking point is going to be closures and layoffs. And that doesn't help anyone because $15 an hour on 0 hours is still $0.
Let me ask you, in your view, what are the ramifications if this were to pass to the creation of some employers of a tip pool in terms of sharing tips with those who are tipped and those who are not?
So what we're hearing directly from employees is, if I'm part of a mandatory tip pool, I'm leaving. They are working for their tips. That is part of their livelihood. And right now, Massachusetts state law says that only tipped employees and people that are directly interacting with them can participate in the tip pool. To open up the tip pool to everyone in the restaurant is not fair to the very people this organization that's pushing this says they're trying to help. Their end game is simple. They want to eliminate tips altogether. They want a European model. They basically come out and said it on several occasions. So this is the first step in a multi-step process that they're trying to get us to a European model. Nobody wants it. It's bad for restaurants. It's bad for servers. Neither of them want it. And the people it's going to impact the most are the consumers that are going to have to pay the price, unfortunately.
Those on the yes side have talked about a lot of the larger restaurant, the chains, that they say, well, they can afford it, air quotes, they can afford this if this were to happen. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that there are some states that actually split this out, where there are employers making a certain amount of revenue in one pocket, if you will, and those more the smaller restaurant, the mom and pops, on another level. I guess my question is: there any way that there could be a compromise on this issue?
Not the way they did this. Unfortunately, ballot questions are a sledgehammer way of doing legislation. They combined multiple issues into one ballot question, and once it's filed, it can't be changed. And the legislature has shown over the past several cycles that they have no intention of changing ballot questions once they've passed or failed. So if you look at these other states, and I'm really glad you mentioned the fact that they talk about chains. If you look at the Red Book argument, they mention big corporations no less than 4 times in a 150-word argument. 91% of restaurants in Massachusetts are small businesses. Think about that number, 91%. This hurts small businesses across the board. And if you see 10% job losses in the first year in Washington, D.C., that's what's going to happen in Boston. What's going to happen in our small communities across the state, in the gateway cities that have been struggling for years to attract new businesses. This is going to make it impossible to open new restaurants in places across Massachusetts. And 10% is probably the best case scenario for a community. We're seeing studies that are saying, I believe it was Michigan released a study this week that said they anticipate 30 to 40% if this were ever eliminated as a statewide issue.
Yeah. Let me ask you finally, Chris, if people want more information on why they should vote no on question 5, how can they find that?
Absolutely. If they visit protecttips.org, you can see all the information that we have. There's actually a page on the website that is fact versus fiction. So we show the other side's arguments, and we point out the blatant inaccuracies that are what they're pushing.
Yep. All right, Chris Keohan from the Committee to Protect Tips, asking voters to vote no on question 5. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We wish you all the best.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. And thank you for joining us here in FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Please make a point to vote on Tuesday, November 5th.